Hi, this is Dr. Rosario, and in this lecture today we are going to be discussing metabolism. When you think of that word metabolism, what things come to mind? Do you think energy, calories, fat burning, food, building muscle? There are lots of different things that may enter your head when you think of that word metabolism. Today, I'm going to define for you what that word means. We're going to discuss different types of metabolism. So I'm going to discuss what we mean by a catabolic and an anabolic pathway. We're going to describe how our cells get the energy they need in order to do work. And then finally, we are going to talk a bit about ATP and how ATP is used as the energy currency of the cell to perform cellular work. Okay, so the word metabolism, it means to change. It comes from that Greek word metaboly. In our cells, the things that drive change are our chemical reactions. They are the agents of change. And metabolism is the set of all chemical reactions that occur within the cell, both those reactions that break molecules down and reactions that build molecules. These different types of reactions often occur in what's called a metabolic pathway, which is what you see pictured in front of you, where you start with one molecule. In this picture, it's molecule A, and you end with a different molecule, the product. Now, this doesn't usually occur in a single step, but rather a series of steps or a series of chemical reactions to get you from point A and point D in this example. It's just like when you are trying to go from one place to another, right? If you're trying to go from your house to school, right? You have a set of turns and paths that you take. With the cell, it's the same way. It has lots of different things that it's trying to achieve at any given time, lots of different products that it's trying to make, and it can take different paths to get to each one of these products. Now, the molecules in between in this picture, so B and C, those molecules, we call those intermediates in a pathway, and you'll notice that for each one of the reactions pictured, there's an enzyme that is involved. And we're going to talk more about enzymes as we get into the next lecture. But for now, what I want you to keep in mind is that metabolism is the set of all chemical reactions that occur within the cell, and that these chemical reactions often occur as a series of steps. We call this series of steps a metabolic pathway. Now we can classify our chemical reactions that make up metabolism into two broad categories. We have our catabolic reactions, and our catabolic reactions break down molecules. We go from a large molecule to simpler, smaller molecules in that series of steps. So in this picture you can see that there's 4 arrows in a row representing a pathway. And these catabolic reactions tend to release energy and raw materials, right? So not only are we breaking molecules down and releasing the chemical potential energy that's stored in them, but we are also releasing small molecules that can be used and recycled by the cell to build other molecules. So a chemical reaction or a process that releases energy, do you remember what that term is to describe it? It's exergonic, right? Our catabolic pathways are exergonic pathways. They are energy releasing pathways. Now the opposite is true for our second type of metabolic reaction, and that is our anabolic reaction. Anabolic reactions build molecules. All right, so here in your picture, we're going from small, simple molecules to a larger, more complex molecule. We're going from disorder to order, and anytime we're going from disorder to order, that is energetically unfavorable, right? We are going against the flow of entropy. So that's going to require an input of energy. And of course, we need our raw materials in order to build those larger molecules. This process is going to be an endergonic process because it requires an input of energy. So an example of an anabolic pathway would be the different chemical reactions necessary for building proteins or building nucleic acids. Bioenergetics describes the flow of energy from one set of chemical reactions, our catabolic reactions, to our anabolic reactions, right? Our endergonic reactions. Here we can see bioenergetics in action, right? So here we have a bear. In order for that bear to survive and do what it needs to do, it needs to consume food, right? And it's consuming, it looks like a salmon. It's taking that chemical energy in that food, and through catabolism, it's converting that chemical energy into a form that it can use, right? So that underscores the first law of thermodynamics, where energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but simply change form. So that's changing form from the fish to a form that the bear can use, and then the bear uses that chemical energy to move, right? Which is what we see in the left or right hand side of this picture. The bear's running, right? Now we have kinetic energy. Meanwhile, that energy ultimately is released in the form of heat, right? Which is the least useful type of energy. It's disordered energy. And those molecules that make up the fish, those organic molecules that make up the fish, are released in their simplest form in the form of carbon dioxide and water, right? So again, that is underscoring the second law of thermodynamics, which is that the entropy of the universe is constantly increasing. Okay, so if we're going to discuss bioenergetics, I need to define for you a couple of terms that define energy within chemical reactions. So the first term that I need to give you is Gibbs free energy, which is just G. All right. And Gibbs free energy is a complicated number, but really what you need to know about it is that it describes the energy of a chemical system. And in this class, we're really focusing on the energy of a molecule. So when we talk about Gibbs free energy in this class, we're talking about the chemical potential energy that is stored in a given molecule. All right, this is a way that we can quantify that. We can give it a number. Free energy change, delta G, is the change in free energy over the course of a chemical reaction. As we go from reactants to products, the energy in those two sets of chemicals is going to be different, right? And we can calculate the difference in free energy over the course of the reaction by subtracting out. So we have the energy of the products minus the energy of the reactants, and that gives us our delta G. So our exergonic reactions, remember exergonic reactions, they release energy. Now when we look at this in terms of our reactants and our products, you can see in the figure here on the right hand side that our reactants have more energy than our products. Now when we calculate our delta G, you'll see that, remember, products comes first in that calculation. The energy of the products minus the energy of the reactants. Here, you're going to get a negative number. Our exergonic reactions, the delta G will always be negative. So you want to commit that to your memory. An exergonic reaction has a negative delta G. So if you see anything with a negative delta G, that means it's spontaneous, it's going to release energy. The opposite is true for our endergonic reactions. Remember, endergonic reactions require an input of energy. So same thing, we calculate delta G by subtracting the energy of the reactants from the energy of the products, and in our endergonic reactions, we can see we get a positive number, and that's telling us that we need to put in energy for this reaction to proceed. It's an uphill process, so to speak. Okay, so keep that calculation in the back of your head, right? So a reaction that is spontaneous, that is exergonic, has a negative delta G. Now let's talk a little bit about cellular work. There's several different types of work that a cell can do. The first is chemical work, right? We mentioned the building of molecules, building of proteins, building of amino acids. That is chemical work. Transport work is moving materials, like moving materials across the plasma membrane, right? That requires an input of energy. We talked about active transport in our last chapter. And mechanical work is the energy of movement, whether that's movement of motor proteins or the movement of the cell as a whole, right? That is work, and that requires an input of energy. So exergonic reactions, those that release energy, are going to provide the energy to perform cellular work through what we call energy coupling, right? So remember, our exergonic reactions, our catabolic reactions, release energy. That energy within the cell is temporarily placed in a molecule of ATP. So remember, ATP, it is adenosine triphosphate. It has three components to the molecule. It has a sugar, ribose, adenine is the nitrogenous base, and there on the left-hand side of the molecule, you have the triphosphate group, right? 3 phosphate functional groups in a row. Energy from catabolic reactions can be used to add that third phosphate group to the molecule. Right. And we're going to see that as we go into chapter 9. That's really what we're going to be focusing on, is how do cells make ATP. Because those 3 phosphates are negatively charged, it requires a substantial amount of energy to attach those phosphate groups to the molecule. As we break down ATP, right, as we release one of the phosphate groups, energy is released with it. So this recycling of ATP, to the production of ATP, we're putting energy on the molecule, and then the hydrolysis of ATP, we're releasing energy from the molecule. That is at the core of all of our different biochemical pathways and different types of cellular work. This process of ATP hydrolysis is exergonic. So it releases energy, and that we can use to perform cellular work. The amount of energy, the delta G for the hydrolysis of ATP, is negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that number, but I want you to recognize that that is a relatively large amount of energy. Okay, so it's negative 7.3. So remember, if it's a negative delta G, that process is energetically favorable. The hydrolysis of ATP is exergonic. Energy is being released. So what we're going to see is ATP carries the energy from our exergonic processes into our endergonic processes. Our catabolic pathways release energy that's going to be transferred to ATP, and then that ATP carries the energy into our endergonic processes, these different types of cellular work that I'm going to discuss. So here we can see an example of ATP in chemical work. So the process of making the amino acid glutamine, which you can see up here at the top of your screen, the process of making glutamine is energetically unfavorable. You're taking glutamic acid, you're adding ammonia to the molecule, you're connecting them together, and you're making glutamine. It has a positive delta G of 3.4 kilocalories per mole. If we couple that to the hydrolysis of ATP in a series of steps where first we take that phosphate from ATP and we attach it to the glutamic acid, which you can see here in step 1, and then we take our ammonia and attach it to the glutamine and release that phosphate group, that then allows for a coupling where that single reaction of glutamic acid and ammonia has a positive delta G. The reaction of ATP hydrolysis has a negative delta G, and the net delta G here now is a negative number. So the hydrolysis of the ATP here, as it's done in 2 steps rather than a single step, powers the production of this amino acid. We can see this also in transport work. We talked about our sodium-potassium pump in our last chapter. In the sodium-potassium pump, it's the same thing. You take the phosphate group from ATP, you temporarily attach it to the pump, and then you pull that phosphate group off the pump, and that provides the energy necessary for transporting solutes from one side of the membrane to the other against their gradient. Finally, the hydrolysis of ATP can also be coupled to the movement of our motor proteins. So these motor proteins, as they are interacting with ATP, the ATP binds, the motor protein changes shape, and then the release of the ADP in the inorganic phosphate results in another change in the shape of the protein. And this allows for the protein to walk literally down the cytoskeletal tract. So these are just a few examples of where we can see the hydrolysis of ATP being coupled to a process within the cell that requires energy, right? Work requires energy. In chapter 9, like I said, we're going to discuss more how that ATP is formed. Where does the energy to make the ATP come from? In lecture 8.3, we're going to get into the details of the enzymes that actually are involved in these processes.